South Africa is rewriting the rules of energy and a century-old giant is fighting for its life. Eskom. 100 years old. Once the most powerful utility on the entire African continent. And right now, it is staring down a private power revolution that could either save South Africa or make Eskom obsolete forever. This is not just a South African story. This is the story of every African nation trying to break free from the colonial infrastructure of the past and build something new. Here is what we are covering today: why South Africa's private power boom is one of the most significant economic shifts happening anywhere in the world right now, and what it means for the future of African energy independence. Stay with me, because the numbers in this story will absolutely floor you. Let us start at the beginning. Eskom, the Electricity Supply Commission, was founded in 1923. Think about that. 1923. When most of Africa was still under the boot of colonial rule, this institution was already being built. For decades, Eskom operated as a monopoly, supplying roughly 95% of South Africa's electricity and about 45% of all electricity generated on the African continent. 45% of an entire continent's power from one utility. For a long time, that was a point of pride. Eskom was proof that African institutions could operate at world scale. But monopolies, unchecked, have a way of rotting from the inside. By the 2000s, warning signs were flashing. Underinvestment in new generation capacity, ballooning debt, and mismanagement, some of it criminal, began to hollow out the giant. Then came load shedding. For those outside South Africa, load shedding means scheduled rolling blackouts. The grid cannot produce enough electricity to meet demand, so power is cut in rotations across the country. At its worst, South Africans were experiencing up to stage 6 load shedding, meaning up to 12 hours of no power per day. Small businesses collapsed. Cold chains broke. Hospitals strained. The World Bank estimated that load shedding was costing the South African economy up to $2 billion every single month. Let that sink in. $2 billion a month, evaporating, because the lights would not stay on. Now here is where the story gets interesting and urgent. Out of this crisis, something remarkable happened. South Africa did not just wait for Eskom to fix itself. The private sector stepped in hard. Under pressure from business, civil society, and frankly, survival instinct, the South African government began loosening the regulations that had locked Eskom into its monopoly. The threshold for self-generation without a license was raised dramatically, first to 1 megawatt, then to 100 megawatts, essentially opening the floodgates. The result? A private power boom that Bloomberg is now calling one of the most dramatic energy market transformations in the developing world. Companies like Scatec, Engie, and dozens of South African independent power producers rushed in. Between 2022 and 2024, South Africa added gigawatts of new private generation capacity. Solar installations exploded. Rooftop solar in particular became a symbol of the shift. South African homeowners and businesses, tired of load shedding, invested an estimated 50 billion South African rand, that is roughly $2.7 billion into rooftop solar alone in just 2 years. This is where it gets complicated for Eskom. Because the people who can afford to leave the grid are leaving. And that is creating what energy economists call a death spiral. Eskom loses its highest paying customers to private solar. Its revenue drops. It raises tariffs on those who cannot afford to leave. That pushes more people to go private. Revenue drops further. The utility weakens. It is a vicious cycle, and Eskom is caught right in the middle of it. Like this video right now, help more Africans see this story. Because what is happening in South Africa is a blueprint or a warning for every nation on this continent. Now let us talk about the key players, because this is not a simple good versus evil story. On one side, you have Eskom now being restructured by the South African government into 3 separate entities: generation, transmission, and distribution. The government has taken over roughly 254 billion rand of Eskom debt. That is a massive taxpayer bailout in exchange for a reform commitment. CEO Dan Marikane is navigating arguably the most difficult leadership role in South African corporate history right now. He has to modernize a 100-year-old giant while competing against the very market forces his government unleashed. On the other side, you have independent power producers, or IPPs, who are moving fast, building fast, and generating real returns. You have international investors from Europe, Asia, and yes, when analysts compare energy investment landscapes, India versus South Africa is becoming a real conversation. India has aggressively courted private energy investment for a decade. South Africa is now on the same path but with far greater urgency, because the blackouts were already happening. And then you have the workers. The National Union of Mine Workers and Eskom's labor unions are watching closely. Coal still powers roughly 80% of South Africa's grid. As renewables eat into their share, job losses in coal communities are a real and painful consequence. This is not abstract. These are communities in Mpumalanga, in the Eastern Cape, real people whose livelihoods were built on the old energy economy. Subscribe for honest, Pan-African analysis you won't find on CNN or BBC, because we will always bring you both sides of the story. Now let us zoom out to the Pan-African picture, because this is why this story matters beyond South Africa's borders. Africa has 600 million people with no reliable access to electricity. 600 million. And yet Africa sits on some of the most abundant renewable energy resources on the planet. The Sahara alone could theoretically power the entire world multiple times over with solar energy. The Congo River Basin holds 40% of Africa's hydroelectric potential. What South Africa is proving messily, painfully, but undeniably is that the old model of the single-state utility monopoly cannot carry Africa into the 21st century alone. The private power boom in South Africa is a signal to the entire continent. It is telling Ethiopia, it is telling Nigeria, it is telling Kenya the market is ready. The capital is there. The technology is cheaper than it has ever been in human history. A solar panel today costs 90% less than it did in 2010. 90% less. And here is the Africa Rising element that does not get told enough: African entrepreneurs are not waiting. South African companies like Starsight Energy, Solar Group, and Cross Boundary Energy are expanding across the continent. They are taking lessons learned in Johannesburg to Lagos, to Nairobi, to Accra. Africa is not importing this energy revolution, Africa is building it. So what does this mean for Africa's future? In the next decade, the continent that was written off as an energy basket case could become the global leader in distributed, decentralized renewable power. Not because the West gave it to Africa, but because crisis forced innovation, and innovation is now unstoppable. For South Africa specifically, the outlook is genuinely cautiously optimistic for the first time in years. Load shedding has decreased significantly in 2024. The longest periods of no load shedding in years were recorded. That is partly Eskom's modest operational improvements, and partly the flood of private power reducing pressure on the grid. The two forces, public and private, are being pushed toward coexistence, however uncomfortably. But the structural challenge remains. Can Eskom transform fast enough? Can South Africa build the transmission infrastructure to carry all this new private power to where it is needed? Can the just energy transition protecting workers in coal communities while building a green future be managed without social explosion? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the defining policy challenges of the next 5 years. What I know is this: Africa does not need permission to lead. South Africa's energy revolution, chaotic as it is proof that when the old systems fail, African ingenuity fills the gap. Check out this next video right here, because we go even deeper into how African nations are competing to attract the green energy investment that will define the next century of development. The world is watching South Africa not with pity, but with envy. Because the transformation happening here, a century-old utility being forced to evolve by a generation that refused to sit in the dark, that is the Africa story that deserves to be told. Now I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments: do you think Eskom can survive the private power revolution, or is the old model finished forever? And if you are watching from South Africa, tell us, are the lights staying on in your neighborhood? Let us have that conversation below.